Bonjour, morgen, grüezi miteinander. As you can hear, neither my French nor my German is unfortunately strong enough, so I will be speaking English, but we will have time to discuss or translate or help each other with understanding of concepts and points and meanings if we have to. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's an honor to be invited. It has been interesting to follow a few of the discussions that took place yesterday. I also want to thank especially Alexander Haskell for arranging everything for me behind the scenes, so I had a chance to appear on the program. Thank you very much for that. The title of my talk is The Evaluation Society and its Consequences for Evaluation of Research. Certain assumptions are buried in that title. The first assumption is that there is such a thing called the Evaluation Society. There is presumably a fairly new phenomenon, a fairly strong phenomenon, and the assumption seems to be that evaluation plays such a strong role that we could even describe society in that term. It's also an assumption built into my title that the evaluation society has some real consequences for evaluation of research, and it shall be my larger mission in my presentation to get as close as possible to an understanding of some of these consequences, or at least how we can conceptualize and understand some of these consequences. Some of these consequences are presumably intended. Some of these consequences are presumably unintended. And there may even be consequences that simply refuse to be categorized as either intended or unintended. Or if we study them close enough, it may turn out that the distinction between unintended and intended consequences is simply not the best and the most relevant one, if we really take the consequence of the term consequence. The outline of what I'm going to say is the following. This is the plan. Whether it collapses along the way, we'll see, but there is a plan. First, I will talk a little bit about the evaluation society, trying to describe it as a new and important and difficult to understand phenomenon, sociologically and politically. Next, I will discuss dimensions of research quality, which of course exemplifies why the problem of the consequences for research are difficult and why it is a complicated issue. If quality has been one-dimensional and easy to measure, we wouldn't really have had a problem. It is also problematic that evaluation has several official purposes and some unofficial purposes, and we will have to take them into account in understanding the consequences of evaluation. After talking about why the problem is new and important and complicated, I will offer two different perspectives, two different ways of talking about and understanding the consequences of evaluation for evaluation society for evaluation of research. These are ways to think about evaluation and its consequences, and to talk about them and to study them, and also two different platforms upon which one can give good advice or suggest prescriptions for how to improve evaluation of research. I will be talking about two paradigms, because in that way we may help avoid a situation in which you think one thing and I think another one, and we embed ourselves so strongly in notions about quality of research. Most of us are also researchers ourselves, and we have investments in meanings and engagements regarding quality of research. By talking about ways of thinking or paradigms, we can perhaps get an arm's length distance to the way we discuss and talk about these things. That is my hope with these two very purified and very ideal typical paradigms. I shall call one of them the metrological paradigm, meaning it has to do with how well we can measure stuff. And I shall call the other one the sociological paradigm, somewhat imprecisely, just to suggest that this paradigm looks at measurement in social contexts. After that, I will sum up, and I'm be perfectly ready to take questions and protests and issues and debates. I hope I have not packed my program too tightly, which means that if there is a problem with language or a concept along the way, there will be time to stop and discuss and clarify, and we can take remaining questions afterwards. We have two very helpful interpreters with us. I have much respect for their work because it's difficult to express yourself clearly in several languages. I sometimes have problems with expressing myself very clearly in only one language. So thanks for that. But as I said, there will be time to clarify and discuss the meaning of concepts if necessary. Okay. The Evaluation Society. Here are some characteristics. In the Evaluation Society, which is my term for a diagnosis of certain trends in contemporary society, we have an unprecedented amount of indicators. In Denmark recently, a PhD thesis was published that discussed more than 100 bibliometric indicators. It is also very easy to come up with new indicators because in certain subfields of the natural sciences, researchers themselves invent new indicators that place themselves individually in certain placements in ranking systems. There seems also to be a strong socio-political investment in indicators. The expectations that we do not any longer have to read publications. We can merely count them in different ways, which is, for some of us, a very surprising idea, that you can count publications, not read them. But there seems to be some investments and some expectation in this idea socio-politically that finally we can get to a point where we can objectively decide the amount and the quality of research. By investment, I don't only mean political expectations. I also mean investments quite literally in infrastructure, in manuals, in indicators, in reports, in web pages. I would also argue that the notion of the Evaluation Society related to indicators permeates or penetrates institutions and social relations to quite a degree. The Evaluation Society is also characterized by what we can call uncertainty and contingency around professionals. The solid ground under professions is not as solid as it used to be. Doctors used to have a privileged insight into medical knowledge, for instance, but now very clever patients will look up on the internet what is the best evidence-based way to treat their particular diagnosis, etc. And it seems to me that a similar situation is relevant for university professors, because there are now lots of people around university professors, including stakeholders and companies and research councils and managers and even students, who have very strong ideas about what university professors need to do. And in that context, measurement of the achievements of university professors seem to play some kind of role. The Evaluation Society is also characterized by the idea that we can measure really grand concepts, not only quality, but also such concepts as equality, innovation, sustainability, democratic deficit, etc. And the idea that such grand concepts which play an important political role can be measured is an interesting idea. I have also read, and I hope I pronounce him correctly in German, Reinhard Koselleck, who is a historian of the concept of ideas, who describes that in modernity, the particular characteristic of some ideas is that they, so to speak, enlarge and expand horizons of expectations. Wonderful example is a democratic deficit. Once you have this concept, then expectations are that something will happen politically to ameliorate that problem. I see a parallel idea in the role of indicators, benchmarking, documentation, etc. Since most of these quantified phenomena are variables, they can be brought to vary, meaning somebody will expect that once we count stuff, the number in the future can change. So it seems to me that the evaluation society transports an expansion of social expectations. Nico Stehr also points to the fact that the knowledge society is characterized by the idea that knowledge itself is a production factor, meaning that once indicators, benchmarks, documentation is produced, it is expected that this documentation, these indicators, etc., will be used to change management practices and professional practices and publication patterns, etc. Stehr uses the term, the social order becomes fragile, meaning it is expected that change will follow after we do evaluation. So in that sense, we can regard the evaluation wave as a production factor for a changing society. The evaluation society is also, I would argue, characterized by what I like to call evaluation machines. Evaluation machines are infrastructures that seem to operate or have the ambition to operate without too much of an element of human judgment. Meaning the ambition is to reduce or eliminate the sense of human touch in evaluation. Therefore, we have infrastructures consisting of indicators and statistics and computers and handbooks and guidelines, meaning that even if we took one individual out of an evaluation committee or out of the production of Google H index production, the machine would produce the same result even if we replaced the individual evaluator. That is the idea embedded in evaluation machines. Which is why you can even symbolically see, if you check on the internet your H index on Google Scholar, there will be a little phrase saying, beware, there might be small mistakes in this number because it was produced by a computer. Which is in contradistinction to some of the expectations we have when research has been previously evaluated, the assumption that only a highly respected expert with a personal judgment could determine the quality of research. The evaluation machines makes it possible to produce evaluations that are large scale in time and place. We can, for instance, rate and rank countries, which is somewhat unusual. Some of the evaluation machines are fairly mandatory and fairly comprehensive, meaning you can't just pretend that you have a life without them. I have never called up anybody and asked them, would you please produce my Scholar H, Google Scholar H index? It was produced entirely without my initiative. It was produced without me having a demand for it. But anybody in this room who wants to spend 1 minute and 30 seconds on finding my H index can do so, regardless of whether I think it is a good idea or not. In that sense, there is a certain compulsory trend in the production of evaluative data. Most characteristically, there has also been in the evaluation society an even stronger separation between work and measurement. We used to have the idea in research that researchers were the best evaluators of research, and we would highly respect evaluations only from somebody who was smarter than ourselves when we had our work evaluated. Not so anymore in the era of evaluation machines. In the era of evaluation machines, the evaluation of work and work itself has been strongly separated, and we call that separation independent evaluation or objective measurement. That leads to, I would say, an objectification of evaluative knowledge, and I mean that here in the simple sense that evaluative knowledge becomes a thing separate from work. I do not mean it in a philosophical, scientific sense, as it is objective, meaning it is through the view of God's eyes. But it has become a thing that has, so to speak, a life of its own. That's what I mean. There is also a whole industry that have a life and a job and an income and a career in the production of evaluative data. And the textbook on organizational sociology, page 1, will say that once you have careers and institutions and an industry, that industry will also have some interests defined by itself. A new set of interests will emerge once you have these institutions. Let me also emphasize before I leave this slide that evidently evaluation of research can be many, many things, and evidently there are many aspects of the evaluation society. On these slides, this one and the previous one, I have emphasized the new and the machine-like and the computerized aspects of the evaluation society, meaning I'm looking now specifically at bibliometrics, metrics, ratings, rankings, indicators, because they particularly embody the new and the large scale and the infrastructure aspects, etc., etc. There has been many forms of evaluation and research before we had the evaluation society. I am emphasizing a particular form, a particular shape, a particular socio-historical phenomenon. Let us put that aside for a little while, assuming that my characteristic is just roughly on the edges somewhat correct. Let's look now on the object of evaluation, meaning the quality of research. I shall now be as clear as possible in my position. I am not now going to tell you what I think the quality of research is, because that would just be a standpoint. I will report to you how I hear people talking in different positions about the quality of research, looking at the discourses, if you will, about research quality as an object of our analysis and common discussion. First, I noticed that the very notion of research quality itself, of course, is evidently contested. Quality is one of the richest concepts we have in our civilization. It has a very rich history, including epistemological and aesthetic and statistical meanings that are partly in contradiction with each other. Here are some further aspects if you want to dimensionalize research quality. We can discuss whether normal science or revolutionary science in Kuhn's meanings do have different quality criteria. In my field, that seems to be the case. We have many teachers of political science who strongly emphasize the teaching of particular methodological rules in how you collect and analyze data, as if these rules constituted research quality as such. I would argue, however, that in the history of political science, we have had revolutionaries who did not live up to the rules of normal science, but nevertheless these are exactly the figures that we now celebrate in political science because they produced grand ideas, not because they produced grand data sets. So it seems to me that these two aspects of scientific work, up to a point, could be evaluated differently for good reasons. Next, it is debatable the extent to which the term impact should be included in our notions of research quality. Some argue that impact is at least one dimension of research quality. Others would argue that impact is something different from research quality, but some include it. Now, let us see why this becomes very complicated very soon. Some tend to assume that if there is impact, we mean research impact, that is tacitly understood as the impact of research upon research. That is what we do in citation analysis, etc. There are others who think that there is a different kind of impact upon society, upon debates, policies, discourses in society, changing notions, what we could call public enlightenment in the broadest sense. Now, these two notions can be connected in two different ways. Some tend to think that research quality in itself is a precondition for impact upon society, whereas others think that these are two different causal paths. One is the impact of research upon research, and the other one is the impact of research upon society. And these latter folks tend to think that there is a direct influence from research upon society that does not hinge upon the quality of the research. I'm not taking a standpoint here. I just report to you that I hear these two very different positions articulated clearly, and they are not in agreement. It is also within the discussion of impact possible to distinguish between outreach and influence. Outreach is whether you sit in committees, participate in debates, appear in newspaper articles, appear on TV, appear in conferences, etc. Another one is whether you have actual influence on decisions. This is what I debated with my dean just 2 days ago when we are discussing the new strategy of my political science department. My dean, much to my surprise, thinks that we should in the future be evaluated contingent upon our influence on policy making. I have extreme difficulties with that idea for a number of reasons, including that there are some politicians who very well, with open eyes, ignore very good research results and still make political decisions. But that's just one of the aspects. Another one is that I could also imagine one of my commissioners one day who would say, Peter Dahler-Larsen, I will make you the king of impact. All you need is to change 2 little numbers in one of your tables, and your results will be useful. And when that conflict comes, I will hope that my dean prioritizes, as I do, the integrity of my research rather than its impact. But we will see when that day comes. There is, of course, the issue of time frames. There is some research that has quick impact, some has very slow impact, and we know that sometimes it takes a long time to process the true meaning of a research result. And time frames are also very different in different disciplines. There are also kinds of quality that are discipline specific. In law, for instance, in my country, most very clever researchers in law publish in Danish because they are in dialogue with Danish lawmakers, whereas we in political science engage ourselves in debates with all kinds of audiences in different parts of the world. Some would also argue that there is publication-specific quality. This is an interesting aspect because some tend to think that if we take journals, we can sort of organize them and rank them, etc. And then once that path is chosen, there is a long discussion about ranking of journals. All the while, the notion of books has been entirely forgotten. Whereas others would argue the book has a meaning in Western civilization. The book has indeed a very strong meaning, and there are certain things that can only be expressed in books. Books have different audiences than articles have. They have different qualities that should be respected, not as the same qualities, but as different qualities than the ones you will find in articles. Furthermore, there is the notion of internationalization. In which countries do you publish? In which languages do you publish? One of the interesting aspects of the discussion of quality in recent years has been that some has tended to confuse the language and the country in which a publication is published as in itself a quality dimension, which is very interesting and relating to what Professor Shalini Randeria told us yesterday. The ability to publish in particular countries, in particular languages, is not evenly distributed across a number of dimensions. Last but not least, almost last but not least, there is the whole notion of recognition. Some tend to think that recognition is a very good proxy variable for quality of research. Others tend to think that recognition is highly socially influenced and not a very good indicator of the research quality of neither individuals, nor groups, nor institutions. And finally, then, of course, the whole notion of quality can be connected to different kinds of objects at different levels of analysis, meaning the individual, the group, the milieu, the institution, and even the country. Now, this is fairly evident, but what is not so evident is the extent to which you can conclude about the quality of one level of analysis by knowing the quality of another level of analysis. Meaning, if my department is evaluated along particular criteria, to which extent can I, as an individual researcher, expect to be evaluated on a similar set of criteria, which remains much more open, even if we acknowledge that these different levels of analysis could be connected with, could be attributed with different qualities. So, this is fairly complicated. It is complicated in a way that once we start measuring things, if we measure temperature outside this room, we assume that a good measurement, repeated by several persons or repeated shortly after one measurement, will show more or less the same result because the notion of temperature remains the same. And the temperature in Bern will only increase gradually along the day. It's a different thing to measure quality, simply because we cannot expect the meaning and concept of quality to remain the same across and after different measurements. So one of the fundamental requirements for us, so to speak, a sound metrological intervention is simply not available when we talk about research quality. Nevertheless, the measurements are produced and of course have some consequences. One more thing. Evaluation has different purposes. Here are 4 official purposes: accountability or control, learning development, enlightenment, meaning we all get wiser as we evaluate, and finally, to create information for the public. These are 4 classical purposes of evaluation mentioned in the literature. These are important to know because most people who will measure things will say we need to know how to measure in relation to the purpose of the measurement. Logically speaking, most people would agree. The problem is, however, that there is no strong and distinct way in which you can keep the other 3 purposes out of the equation once you have chosen one of these purposes. Even if you do in your department a research evaluation with the purpose of learning, you may find that your dean will ask you, so how far did you get with your learning process? In other words, these can be separated on paper and analytically, but in practice they are extremely difficult to separate. which of course complicates the idea that you should measure in ways that are only consistent with one particular clear and well-defined purpose. That said, I will now introduce the two ways of thinking about this whole problem that I promised you in the beginning of my presentation. First, let's talk about the metrological paradigm or perspective. Its purpose is simply to find out how do we measure things in the best and most solid and respectable way so that we can make rational decisions based on evaluative data. That assumes that the purposes we have are preordinate. I mean, before we start measuring, we know what the purpose is. That our concepts are fairly clear. We know what quality is, since we can then operationalize it. And quality tends to be the only or the most important value at stake. The role of the tool is informative. The purpose is to inform decisions so that they become well-informed decisions. The knowledge producers are the specialists. Notice, for instance, the role of bibliometricians in the ongoing discussions about measurement of research quality in our society at the moment. The key to use is the official decision. This person should be hired, this person should not, resources should go here, we should have less resources, this is to be promoted, this is not to be promoted. The key to use is the official decision. And the main orientation is prescriptive, meaning you should not use only one indicator. When you use an indicator, it should be clear and well-defined and transparent, and you should correct mistakes, etc., etc. Let's compare that to what I call the sociological paradigm. For lack of a better term, the meaning is here simply to say, let us not prescribe what should happen in measurement. Let us study what actually happens with measurements once they are let loose in actual real-life contexts. And there is no measurement that just hangs in the air, that does not take place in time and place and around living people. So let's study what happens. And let's suspend for a while our judgment on whether things happening in a good way or a bad way. Let us study what actually happens. Purposes may then become constructed. Some may use data for learning purposes. Others may take the same data and say, well, let us use them a little bit for comparative purposes or control purposes. Concepts are also defined in the making, meaning that once we measure things, we partly also define them. The values at stake are quality, fairness, truthfulness, usefulness, whatever people may come up with in a particular concrete situation. The role of the tool is more than informative. It's what I call constitutive, meaning it helps define what it claims to measure. The knowledge producers are multiple. Even researchers themselves may produce evaluative knowledge about their own research. The key to use is not only a decision, but also how evaluative information permeates and influences our language, our practices, our interactions, and our imaginations, our imaginative ideals about what constitutes good research. And the main orientation here is to describe what's going on, to really understand what's going on, not to prescribe better practices, or at least for a moment suspend a little bit how measurements should be done, and instead study how they are actually done. Let me then go into depth a little bit with each of these two ways of looking at things. For example, the Leiden Manifesto was published in Nature just 1 year ago, where really good, some of the best bibliometrical researchers in the world sat together and produced a manifesto saying, here is how you should use bibliometric data in a sound and healthy and respectful way insofar as you can. They came up with 10 principles. Here are some examples. Measure performance only against missions and purposes, not just in general. Keep data collection processes transparent and simple. Allow those who are evaluated to verify data and analysis. It bothers me quite a lot, for instance, to see that there are references in the international literature to Dahler-Larsen, L-A-R-S-O-N, which is how they would spell my name if I were born in Sweden, but I'm not. I'm a Dane, so we spell it L-A-R-S-E-N. But Larsen references are never counted in my bibliometric data, although clearly there is no Swede called Peter Dahler-Larsen. 6. Account for variation by field in publication and citation practices. 10. Scrutinize indicators regularly and update them. I read these examples as thoughtful and sound principles according very consistently with the metrological paradigm. This is how we can do measurement better to produce more rational decisions. Let me now move to some findings and observations based on what I would call the sociological paradigm. Are you with me where I'm going? Okay, thanks. Here are some findings. These are empirical findings from my part of the world. One finding is there's very uneven implementation of performance regimes, even among universities in one country that has the same legislation. There are many, many levels of influence. Managerial decisions seem to be made in very different ways. And even down to the departmental level and to the individual level, there's a wide discrepancy in implementation practices, regardless of the fact that there is the same measurement system and the same legislation regarding bibliometric measurements in a country. One of my colleagues by the name of Jonas Krolin described 2 universities who scored very differently on bibliometric indicators. And one of them had a very intense focus on encouraging each researcher to produce more, whereas the other one had a much more loose practice. His explanation was that there was something about the historical institutional profiles about these universities that made them differ in their response to the performance system. My argument was that his data was also conflated with the fact that one of them had a very low score on bibliometric measures and the other one had a very high score. So the pressure to act was much higher on the university that had the lower score, which is why it needed to be much more careful with implementation and monitoring of the score. We also had a research center in Denmark who followed up on our bibliometric system in Denmark and found out that there was an incredible uneven knowledge about performance indicators among the researchers, meaning there were some researchers who didn't even know how their publications were counted. And for that reason, they couldn't react strongly to that system. It is impossible to imagine that the evaluation system colonizes the minds of researchers if the researchers don't know about the bibliometric system. There is also, even within the same country, very uneven translation into standards for individual performance. Some get even paid to produce particular articles, some do not. There's also very uneven reactions among researchers, have I found, that are not explained by money and career alone. So the symbolic role seems to be an important one. Let's get a little bit closer to that. Let me introduce the notion of constitutive effects. The constitutive effect is the kind of influence that bibliometric and other metrics may have on minds and practices and ideas about good research. Constitutive effects happen when indicators become a way of seeing reality, when an indicator system defines what it claims to measure, and when it, so to speak, shapes a landscape of meanings in which researchers then act. I go here beyond the distinction between intended and unintended consequences. To me, analytically, it doesn't matter very much whether a consequence was intended or unintended if it nevertheless helps shape reality for researchers. Let me go further with this idea. Let me suggest that constitutive effects of evaluation may manifest itself in different aspects of research, Let's say, for instance, in terms of the content of research, or the time frames of research, or the worldview that characterizes research, and the social relations that characterize researchers in relation to managers, colleagues, etc. In terms of content, types of publication can be recommended by particular evaluative regimes so that researchers steer their energy into particular types of publication, and into particular types of language. In Denmark, we have had a very interesting discussion about this, because as a new bibliometrical system was defined, a particular high premium was given to publications in English, in particular also English books. When a particular party in our parliament discovered that fact, they wanted to have that system changed because they wanted us to maintain our interest in publication in Danish based on a nationalist Danish perspective. So a moratorium was put on the bibliometric system with regard to language for a couple of years until they put their attention in other places after some time. Here is another point. In terms of content, in the metrological paradigm, most people tend to think that it is absolutely fair that we compare sociology only with sociology, history only with history, and chemistry only with chemistry. Most people would see that rule as uncontroversial. It is also a rule that is very difficult to disagree with. But here is a complication that most people tend to forget. If we compare a particular field in one country with a particular field in another country so that the fields are comparable, somebody needs to be in control of how that field is defined so we know what is inside and outside the field. That is an important control function. And some people who say that similar things should only be compared with similar things tend to forget that then they also subscribe to a control of these so-called similar things. Let me give you an example. My department is a department of Statskundskab. Statskundskab is the Danish term for something which I in German understand is pretty close to Staatslehre. Does that make sense in German? Right? Learning about how the state functions, how it is built, how public administration works, how the law works, all this kind of thing, the machinery of the state. Now, if we compare Statskundskab bibliometrically, we will have to compare it with political science, because political science, Statskundskab, tomato, tomato, potato, potato, is probably the same thing. So we compare ourselves with political science in the US, which is differently defined than Statskundskab. But then the people in Statskundskab who like to be compared with political science says, oh, Statskundskab, that's pretty much the same thing. If you look at the social function of Statskundskab, however, it is to train bureaucrats in the public sector. The purpose of political science is to train political scientists. So the two purposes of these different fields in different countries are simply not the same. And if we compared the social function of Statskundskab, we would compare it in the US to not political science, but public management. And I can promise you that would give us a completely different basis for the comparison. So it is easy to say that like things should be compared with like, but there will be constitutive effects on the definitions of fields as a consequence. The fields are not evident and they are not God-given. Okay? Time frames are of course different. Managers tend to be interested in time frames of around 2, 3, or 4 years because that's the time they are managers until they move on to the next position. I tend to be interested in the very long run. I tend to be interested as a researcher in having my books on just one little shelf in the library, even if I'm buried in my grave. I want one of my books to be on the shelf in the library. And that book will be there with my name on it, even if all the managers have vanished from the surface of the earth. So that's my time frame. So different partners in this game have very different time frames. There's also something called the worldview, meaning what is the larger meaning of research in society? And when you subscribe to a measurement of a particular type of impact in a particular way, you also subscribe to a model of how research should play a role in society. I cannot not refer to Karl Popper, who said that in a free and open society, there's also a certain autonomous life in institutions such as families, churches, schools, and universities. Social relations seems to be affected, as I see it, by the constitutive effects of evaluative information. If you look at a university system with managers, publics, funders, students, researchers, heads of departments, journalists, whose knowledge position is it that needs to be strengthened? Who needs to have their knowledge needs served? It is also interesting for me to see that the relations between colleagues seem to change in the light of evaluative information. I would here strongly emphasize, I'm not saying whether this is good or bad, but relations are changing. Here is a way to talk about the ways constitutive effects become real. Meaning, why are the social processes facilitating effects like the constitutive effects? One could be what we call the zeitgeist. Well, everybody talks about this new phenomenon, so it must be important. Organizational procedures such as evaluation routines also seem to direct attention to certain phenomena and not to others. Here is another way in which constitutive effects become real, which I have experienced in my own milieus. Let's say that there is a stronger incentive to publish in certain journals at a certain point in time. Especially younger researchers may be very much in doubt. How do I need to write? How do I need to think? How do I need to conceive of the problems I describe in my research in order to get published in those journals? In most departments, there will then be one or two persons who say, it just so happens that I am senior. I have the insight. I have the secret key to open up the secret door to those journals. All you have to do is follow my prescriptions in terms of paradigms, problem definitions, and methodologies. And I will tell you how you can get into those journals. Sometimes the role of these so-called local experts, if you will, makes the constitutive effect of the bibliometric measure even stronger than the bibliometric measure itself. Even also if the secret key that is held by that person maybe isn't that secret, and maybe it isn't even a key. It may also happen that people react very effectively to bibliometric indicators. This seems to me to be totally under-researched. The metrological paradigm, so to speak, suggests that all decisions are rational based on information, etc. And it seems to me that the affective dimension of bibliometric measurement has simply been totally under-researched. But people take their self-esteem into account when they see how they are evaluated. The status differentials between the different colleagues in the department changes as a result of who get good evaluative information back. And the strategies that individual researchers plan for their own life becomes more or less influenced by how they would see their chances of getting praised and getting chances to having themselves praised as a result of what they do. Sometimes younger researchers even ask for clarification. They would say to their managers, oh, we are a little bit unsure, what should we do? Because then these bibliometrics come up, etc. And the request for clarification sometimes even constitutes a push for itself, as in itself, for the institution to become more clear, more specific, more univocal in its demands upon its employees. There is a mechanism called institutional lock-in. After a while, Debates tend to wither away. New facts become new realities. And even if people disagree with the basic premises of bibliometric measurements, most people tend to accept the fact that they actually exist. So the fact becomes the norm. I have also sometimes noticed what I call ad hominem arguments, meaning that the argument about a bibliometric measure has very much to do with the person that makes the argument, or the counter-argument has a lot to do with the person, rather than with the principle. Let me give you one example that creates a dilemma for those who are critical about bibliometric measurement. Assume that you are critical about the bibliometric measurement. We can then put you in two groups. You can be a so-called high performer, objectively speaking, or you could be a low performer. If you are really a high performer, you have no need to articulate the critique because you're already a high performer. So why waste your time and energy to do that? If you are a low performer, it may be difficult to voice the critique. Why? Because you are a low performer. I have heard this articulated very elegantly at the conference. Let's say that I'm a presenter. I'm very much in favor of a new bibliometric system, new bibliometric indicator. Let's say one of the honorable gentlemen in the room asked me a question that is very much a critical question about this indicator. I would then look that person straight in the eyes and said, "Sir, I really respect your question. It's a wonderful question. But in the long run, I do think that the individual researcher's research quality correlates with bibliometric measurement. Meaning that if you have a problem with it, it is because you don't know how to produce a high score in the bibliometric measurement. But I didn't say that, I just said it tended to correlate. So in a very elegant way, I said something about the person who made the argument without bringing that person on board. So in the long run, if this mechanism is more or less the one that actually happens, there will be a statistical correlation between those who are critical and those who are low performers. And it will then one day be possible to say, but you just say that because you don't know how to perform. Which in a sort of way sidetracks a more principled discussion about the bibliometric measurements. Here is the distinction between types of position among my colleagues that I found when we introduced in Denmark what is called the BFI, which is a Danish abbreviation for a bibliometric research indicator. The indicator is based on counting all publications, putting them in two groups. The highest ranking groups of publications is only the ones that fall in the 20% best journals and or the 20% best publishers, to be determined by experts in all fields. So all publications that are peer-reviewed are counted, and then giving more points if they are in the fine category and fewer points if they are in the lower category. This was introduced and created, as you can expect, quite a lot of turmoil among Danish researchers. I did qualitative research and fieldwork among my friends and colleagues as this happened, and I found out that their position was easily to be explained as a result of two dimensions in the way they were thinking about the bibliometric indicator. One is whether they thought it was fairly clear or whether it would be used in a fairly unclear way, meaning we don't know how much money will follow, we don't know how managers will think, we don't know if we can buy ourselves out if we do a little bit of management every now and then, we don't know how it will be implemented, etc. Some were optimists and some were pessimists. Based on these distinctions, my colleagues ended up being in 4 different categories. The optimists who said, finally now we know how research quality is defined, so just let's produce a lot of that. The optimists who were still ambiguous said, yeah, it's a little bit unclear, but we will exploit that unclarity. I'll produce a little bit of that, a little bit of this, I'll get some external money here and there, and unclarity in the long run, that is the air that I breathe in my department. That's the unclarity. That's what makes me have a space for maneuvering. The pessimists said, however, now only this one thing and it makes me very stressed because I used to produce this kind of research and it's no longer recognized. There were also some pessimists who were fairly confused, who said, I don't know what to do now because it's all unclear and they measure one thing and it's not relevant and I don't know how to handle my life. But the trick is that if you want to understand the effects of the bibliometric system upon researchers as such, the average makes no sense. It is the different positions that researchers take that need to be understood. It's a relational phenomenon. How could it be that some see ambiguity in these phenomena? Perhaps some see ambiguity in these phenomena, even if one indicator is very precisely defined, as suggested by the metrological paradigm. So my question is, how could it be in practice that people see and feel ambiguity and uncertainty? Perhaps it could be because they would ask themselves, which of several indicators are the most important? Because we have the bibliometric indicators, we have high-ranking journals, we also have impact factors which are not totally correlated with the Danish bibliometric system, etc. So which one of them, all of them being precise, but which of them will really count? Another source of ambiguity is, yes, but my career depends not on the bibliometric indicator, but on the assessment committee that will look at my work. For instance, after I have been a postdoc, I apply for associate professorship. What will the assessment committee think? And the trick is that no one really knows until you see who sits in the assessment committee. In my country, there are certain rules and procedures, but you cannot tie the hands of the assessment committee. So how much weight will they put on different kinds of evidence when they make their judgment? That is unknown. Even if indicators are precise, what are the minimum requirements and the maximum requirements? By minimum requirements, I mean this is what you must, this is the threshold you must pass to be accepted for a new position or for promotion, etc. In many, many research contexts, there is a clear indicator, but there is no clear definition of the minimum requirement. And rarely have I seen a maximum requirement, which is actually very interesting. I have never heard the dean say to me, Peter, you can only publish one book every 2 years. In our university, you can't produce more than that. I have never heard that, which means, of course, that for purely mathematical reasons, performance management is completely open-ended upwards. Everybody thinks it's entirely precise, but it's completely open-ended upwards. Sociologically speaking, it cannot be infused with certainty as long as it is open-ended upwards. In other words, you can keep people constantly in doubt whether they have produced enough, even if you have very precise indicators. That seems to me to be an important sociological mechanism. Do collective goals apply to individuals? Meaning, if these are the research goals of my department, to which extent should I fulfill all of these goals or some of them, and how will we count my contribution if I do not score well on all of these goals? Will there be any compensation related to my age, my gender, my family situation, my subfield, my teaching obligations, my potential management roles, and other workplace contributions? It seems to me that most workplaces have some sort of compensation mechanisms, but some of them are not very official. And sometimes the trick is which compensation mechanism exists on top of the very precise indicators, not the indicators themselves. So it seems to me that researchers who are very much in doubt about the actual implication of such bibliometric systems have good organizational and sociological reasons to actually feel that there is a strong ambiguity. Unfortunately, you may argue that even though on the one hand it may increase incentive to produce because you never know when you have produced enough. There is also research on the psychosocial work environment that suggests that too much uncertainty and ambiguity about performance demands are really critical for producing stress among researchers. I would therefore suggest that managers who make decisions about indicators take the socially productive meaning of ambiguity and uncertainty into account when they make decisions. Notice here how differently the two paradigms that I have talked about will talk about ambiguity and uncertainty. If you subscribe to the metrological paradigm, we should produce as sound and reasonable and precise measurements as possible so that we can make rational decisions. According to this paradigm, ambiguity and uncertainty are only temporary. They will disappear once we have gotten better measures. According to the sociological paradigm, however, as I have called it, ambiguity and uncertainty will probably remain in this world for quite some time. It's not going to go away. And in the meantime, they may be triggers for sense-making and imagination, and as such, they may be highly productive. They may be highly productive for research production, but they may also be highly productive in terms of competitive relations among researchers, and for some, in relation to stress and burnout. Finally, before I land, a couple of wider implications of what I have said. If indicators through constitutive effects help establish the reality they claim to measure, in other words, if we know after some time that this is quality because this is the way we measured quality, then it makes little sense afterwards to criticize them for lack of validity because they have simply helped define what they claim to measure. And to call these effects just unintended seems to me to be to miss their socio-political significance. Finally, one more thing in a long-term perspective, evaluatively. There is an interesting phenomenon when a certain set of indicators help define research quality in a particular context. If then researchers start to produce more based on that notion of indicators, some will claim later on that research production has increased because they have now produced more according to that set of indicators. And some will claim, point one, research has gone up, and two, the bibliometric system was a success because it made production go up. If we subscribe, however, to what I have called the sociological paradigm, this is not a valid type of argument. The reason being, one thing is to document growing production compared to on the basis of this indicator. Another thing is to evaluate the way good research is defined as production by means of this indicator. And these two are conflated when you use the very same indicator to document an increase that is produced by that indicator at the same time as the same indicator defines what research quality is. Yeah. That is, in a sense, a self-fulfilling prophecy. That is the way in which evaluation systems document their own success by simply defining quality as a mirror of their own assumptions. Finally, these were the two perspectives that I have offered for you. They are both simplifications. You may criticize my headlines, you may criticize what I have put in each cell. I hope that you don't evaluate them based on how precisely they're defined, but by how useful they may be for your thinking. I would also argue that both of these perspectives or paradigms have a role to play in our debate on evaluation of research. And I would even argue that both of them have certain advantages and certain blind spots. I'm with the metrological paradigm in the sense that, of course, measurements need to be as reliable and valid as possible in order to make good decisions. Nobody disagrees with that. But I do think that there is a blind spot in the metrological perspective in that it overfocuses so much on official purposes only, and it overfocuses so much on rational decisions only, ignoring all the other ways that bibliometric indicators have an impact on the whole research system and collegial relations and life at work at university. I have much sympathy for the sociological paradigm. I think it helps us produce interesting insights, and I think those who make decisions about bibliometrical indicators need to keep themselves informed about all the complex ways in which these indicators help redefine the reality in which they operate. One of the problems, however, I have with the sociological paradigm is that sometimes it isn't very clear about the meaning of its own prescriptions. Perhaps prescriptions can only be articulated very vaguely, such as don't overestimate determinism. Be more attentive to the complexities and the non-linearity of the consequences, for instance. And respect actual findings, not intended findings, but actual findings of the consequences of research. And don't react too strongly to ambiguity and uncertainty, because the reaction to uncertainty and ambiguity may even be worse than the ambiguity and the uncertainty itself. Although, of course, ambiguity and uncertainty up to a point can also be a problem. A further complication I have with the sociological paradigm is that sometimes it is used to issue a kind of social critique where we don't really know the basis of the critique. If the assumption is everything was better in the old days when we didn't evaluate systematically, I would not say that that is a very solid and valid statement. Things were not necessarily better in the old days, at least not without taking into account who tells the narrative about the old days and with what flavor does that narrative about the wonderful old days come. So things are complicated. Things are complicated seen from both perspectives. Both perspectives are needed. And my humble hope is that they are just a little bit helpful for our discussion. If you want to discuss something else, I'm available too. Thank you for your attention.
Dagmar.
Okay, thank you very much for this inspiring talk. I have a question to the first part of your talk. You talk about these evaluation machines, this evaluation industry and so on. And on the other side, these objective evaluations separate from scientific work. But does this really mean more in an analytical or conceptual way when we talk about a separate regime in the science system? And I mean science as a professional system, a system more in the thinking or way of Max Weber. Do you think it would be longer a separate machine, a separate system in the science system, or is there a possibility to integrate it in a way that the science as a profession could live with this system?
Thank you. An extremely important question, the implications of which are difficult to capture in their totality. I would argue, for all of the things being equal, I would argue for some level of the separation thesis, so to speak. If you look at the way institutions are built, if you look at the way experts are hired and paid. And if you look at the particular values embedded in institutions and the incentive structures, I think the argument can be made that there is, to an increasing extent, an autonomization of the evaluation industry. Let me just give you an anecdote that illustrates this. I was in the committee evaluating the PhD thesis of a very good young scholar who looked at some aspects of evaluation. I saw in him, in his thesis, brilliance. You know, when you're a researcher, you look at other people, even if they're young, even if it's not complete yet and little parts are missing, but you see this element of strong conceptual thinking and a promising career, and you would really want to encourage that person to, you know, continue working with that idea and exploiting it, because after that idea there would be, you could imagine 5 other good ideas follow from that. Right after he achieved his PhD degree, he decided to leave academia. And I was surprised. I didn't know him personally, but I was just surprised. And I asked him, why did you choose to leave academia? Because I thought your PhD thesis was really promising, and I hope I conveyed to you that despite of my critique, which I have to give because I'm an academic, I was also encouraging when I was in that committee. And he said, oh yes, but the Research Center for Evaluation of Research has offered me this wonderful job. Okay, I said, congratulations. And he said, and they will give me 10,000 more per month if I evaluate research rather than do research. Which I then said, of course, okay, good for them. But I wish I could live in a world where there would at least be equal pay for those who did research and those who evaluated, at the very least. Because there are uncertainties enough in the research world. So I think it symbolizes how society prioritizes these different institutions that do different things. And the separation of work and measurement of work is not in my slide by coincidence, because we saw that in industry 100 years ago, and we saw the detrimental effects of separating work from the measurement of work. And the experiences from industry were not good experiences.
Also from my side, I have a double question for you in terms of on the future of research evaluations. You seem to imply in your talk that basically this trend, this evaluation machine, to a certain degree is there to stay. And my question is, well, is it really so? You may see the 2 problems in terms of the sustainability of this evaluation industry. The first one is that probably there is at the broader societal level now less of an expectation. You talked about the social expectations connected with these steps, saying, well, if this is the result, then something political may or should happen on that. Don't you recognize a certain disappointment now in the public opinion, at least in our world, in terms of the results of research in general, that has created a kind of dichotomy between those who believe in research and they would go towards these expectations, and a growing group of people in our society, perhaps already a majority, that is rather disenchanted with research and that has a certain doubt whether research really plays a role in driving political decisions. And the second question or small reservation that I have is that especially on our continent, I don't know how it is in Denmark, but I know how it is in Switzerland, and the funding of universities depends 0 on evaluation, on research evaluation, because in Switzerland it just depends on the potential, on the financial potential of the canton that supports that university. Whether a university performs well or poorly in the rankings plays zero role in the budget that it will have. And so in this respect, I wonder whether we are not talking here about a discourse, an academic discourse, which is interesting in itself, but that may have less consequences on real decisions, on real political decisions, than what your presentation implies.
Yeah. Thank you. Another incredibly important question. In a presentation like this, when I have a fairly short amount of time to give as much as I can of a complicated message, I simplify things a little bit, and I also oversimplify them to make a point. You are absolutely correct that you could also, in contradistinction to my presentation of the Evaluation Society, find counter tendencies and countercurrents and various kinds of protests. Some of the protests are what we could call in the so-called post-factual society. That would be one kind of issue. Another kind of issue would be that there would be certain political or administrative logics or administrative structures, as the one you reported in Switzerland, that sort of creates a buffer to the importance of these mechanisms. I respect that. But in my findings, I have found that there is quite an important influence that cannot be explained by money alone. I respect money. Lawyers, guns, and money are always important. But there is also an important influence in discourse and ideas and imaginations that are not connected to money streams. And I wouldn't say money is not important. It's just like both ways of influence are important. The hard influence and the soft power, both of them are important, I would say. It is extremely interesting to follow over the years which kinds of evaluation are having tailwind and which one have more problems with it. I would argue, though, if we look at it in a real long-term perspective, over the decades and over the centuries, there is an aspect of modernization here, and here I'm a Max Weber fan. There are just some of these machineries. The way they grow it just looks as if it is autonomous when you look at it. It's amazing, and it also shows that I would see it as a part of my presentation to say clearly, I do not think it is realistic to dream of a situation in which we don't have evaluation. If we don't have evaluation, we would also have to not write diaries. We would also have to not look ourselves in the mirror. I mean, it is such an important part of modern life. It's just an extra layer of organization and investment, etc. Finally, the skepticism. I'm totally with you. I write about this. I think we would make an important step forward if we could also include that skepticism in evaluation itself, simply by weakening its ambition to produce strong and solid and rational statements. I'm very inspired by Gianni Vattimo and his ideas of weakening the authoritative thinking, because we need evaluation. It does just not need to be conceived as so much more authoritative than the other kinds of knowledge we have in society.